Undercover boss orders apple pie at bakery cafe stops cold when waitress says one tip change could feed staff. Michael Foster, 50 years old, the founder of the famous Foster's Bakery Cafe chain, stepped into one of his smaller branches during a sweltering noon. His simple gray shirt paired with faded jeans and his quiet demeanor made him look no different from an ordinary customer, betraying none of the authority of a major business owner. The harsh sunlight from outside streamed through the glass window, casting a sparkling glow on the golden apple pies in the display case, making them even more appealing amidst the somewhat stifling atmosphere. The whir of the coffee machine blended with the murmur of customers chatting, creating a complex melody both familiar and infused with the invisible pressures of a working day. Michael pulled out a chair near the window, a spot that allowed him to easily observe all the activity in the shop. From this vantage, he could see the barista station, the pastry counter, and the hurried eyes of the servers darting back and forth between tables. Today, he carries no powerful CEO title, no meeting awaited him, and there was no big contract signing ahead. Today, he just wanted to be an ordinary customer sitting among the faint aroma of coffee to see how his brainchild was running and whether it still held the values he had built from the very beginning. The air in the shop seemed to thicken every time a new customer walked in. The wooden chairs were neatly arranged, a bit old but clean. On one wall, a small blackboard handwritten with homemade apple pie with a hint of cinnamon served with fresh cream. That line made Michael smile gently. He remembered the early days of handwriting menus, when Foster's was just a tiny shop in the old quarter, long before it became the renowned brand it is today. A young female server, brown hair, neatly dressed, hurriedly brought apple pie to a customer at a table by the window. Her eyes reflected fatigue, yet she still managed a polite smile. Michael watched every little movement, his heart tightened for a moment. He knew behind that smile were countless hours of exhausting work, wages that were not always enough, and fragile hopes that tomorrow would be better than today. In front of him, in the mirror behind the bar, his reflection appeared, a man who had dedicated his entire youth to building Foster's Bakery Cafe into a friendly brand, yet wondered if the very principles he once laid down had become a burden for his employees under the management structure. That thought flickered by like a wisp of smoke, tightening his chest. The doorbell chimed as a new customer entered. Michael tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowed in observation, preparing for whatever might unfold next, because today was not just an ordinary afternoon. Today was the day he needed to confront the values he had established, to see if they remained intact or had faded under the weight of numbers and business pressures. Emily, the young server with brown hair tied neatly at the back, slender build but slightly slumped shoulders from carrying too many worries, approached Michael's table. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window, casting both a soft and harsh light on her face, highlighting every line of fatigue etched into her eyes, though she still tried to keep the ever-present smile of a dedicated server. "Hello," she greeted, her voice gentle and polite, but there was something in that voice that quivered like a fragile string. "What would you like to order, sir?" Michael looked up, his eyes resting on the girl's smile, then gave a small nod. His voice was calm. "One slice of apple pie, thank you." Emily quickly jotted it down in her small notebook, but Michael noticed her hand trembling slightly. A moment of silence passed, so long that he felt every sound around him, the coffee machine, the clinking of spoons against cups, even the creaking ceiling fan seemed to drain from the room, leaving only the sound of his breathing, and her eyes drifting into a distant void. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, as if confessing something she wasn't allowed to say. Flustered, she lowered her head, but then, as if unable to contain it any longer, she lifted her chin, her voice breaking into fragments, but filled with determination. "You know, just one small change in the tipping policy would be enough for us to have a proper lunch." That sentence fell in the small cafe like a cold raindrop, shattering the atmosphere that still held some warmth from the apple pie and the sunlight streaming through the window. Michael tilted his head, his eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to read deeper into the girl's eyes, where a small spark of hope had just ignited, but also the disappointment that only someone in the industry could truly understand. The cafe seemed to freeze. Across the pastry counter, a middle-aged man turning a newspaper frowned slightly. His gaze shifted from Michael to Emily, full of questions. A group of students at a corner table suddenly fell silent. Their eyes were fixed on Michael's table, as if awaiting the finale of an unannounced drama. Michael placed his hand on the table, his fingers tapping lightly, as if listening to a familiar song he'd heard somewhere before. Emily's words still lingered in the air, like the night's mist yet to dissipate. He realized it wasn't just a casual question nor a complaint. It was a cry for help, small yet powerful enough to shake the very values he once believed he had built to stand as solid as a fortress. Emily still stood there, her hand clutching the order book, her eyes darting away, yet her feet seemed glued to the spot. That gaze, tired yet resolute, reflected back at him the very image of himself in those early days of building this cafe empire. A small person but carrying a big dream of fairness, of valuing labor, and of human decency. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, merging with her steady but hurried breathing. In that moment, Michael felt every neon light, every whir of the coffee machine, every sweet scent of apple pie, all converging into one single thing, an unspoken question that needed no answer but demanded to be heard. He didn't say anything, just smiled slightly, a smile of understanding, but behind it was a surge of emotion swirling like an underground current. Because he knew a small change in the tipping policy, something he once thought of as just a figure on a revenue report, could become the only bridge between survival and hope for the people on the front lines serving customers like him. The doorbell rang again, a new customer entered, laughter and conversation filled the air once more, as if the exchange between Michael and Emily had never happened. But Michael knew in that very moment a crack had opened, small yet enough to let the light of justice shine through. He sat still, his eyes following Emily, the young woman whose eyes carried the weight of repressed dreams. And in that moment, amidst the sound of the coffee machine, the sweet smell of apple pie, and his own breath, Michael understood this afternoon was no longer an ordinary one. It had become a turning point, a wake-up call for him to stand up and change the things that seemed small but held incredible power. Michael leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into Emily's eyes bearing not only the dark circles of fatigue, but also the marks of rare courage and deep-seated concerns. His voice rose steady and firm like a door closing behind them, so only he and she were left in a serious conversation. "What did you just say?" Emily looked momentarily. Flustered, her hands trembled as she clenched her order book, her thin fingers as if holding onto something fragile. She looked up, her eyes trembling, but still strong, her voice breaking into sounds small but sharp as a knife, cutting through the sweetness of the apple pie-filled air. "Just a fair share of the tips, enough for us to afford a decent meal. But with the current policy," her voice caught for a moment as if swallowing tears, then she gulped hard, trying to hide the pain, "we can hardly afford even one lunch." Each word fell on the tiled floor like cold drops of water, freezing the air in the cafe. The old wooden chairs fell silent like silent witnesses. A middle-aged man sitting nearby stopped his spoon in mid-stir, his eyes narrowed, looking at Emily as if waiting for an explanation from deep within the girl's heart, an explanation he knew no one could deny. Behind the pastry counter, another employee, blonde hair, tall and thin, quietly lowered his head, his shoulders trembling slightly as if wanting to say something, but held back by something as heavy as a boulder, the fear of losing his job. His eyes did not dare to look up, but only stared at the floor, where drops of dried coffee were like drops of blood long forgotten. Michael sat up straight, his eyes turned cold and his hands clenched lightly into fists. In those eyes there was a suppressed fury, not anger at Emily, but at the very system he himself had built, where seemingly reasonable policies had inadvertently suffocated the very people he had once trusted most. Because he knew all too well every payslip, every year-end report chart, could never capture these tears, the silent tears shed in the shadows of late-night shifts. Emily clutched her order book as if to steady herself. Then she spoke slowly, her voice now steadier, but her eyes still full of pleading. "I don't want anyone to pity us, Mr. Foster. I just want everyone to understand that we don't just need a minimum wage. We need fair treatment. A decent tip policy, that's all would be enough for us to not have to scramble around borrowing money just to afford a decent meal." A faint sigh escaped from a corner of the room. The middle-aged man still watching, his hand trembled slightly, his eyes fixed on Michael like a giant question mark. A young couple who had just walked in also froze their eyes, darting from Michael to Emily's conflicted face. Michael took a deep breath, as if to swallow all those words into his chest. His eyes swept around the cafe, every customer, every employee, and he realized this was no longer an ordinary cafe. It had become a stage where everyone was playing a role. The manager, the server, the customer, and even himself, the founder, sitting in the midst of a smoldering rebellion he could no longer ignore. He slowly closed his eyes, and images from the early days of building Foster's Bakery Cafe came flooding back like a rainstorm of memories. He remembered his own sweat, the long nights, the dream of a decent place where everyone was treated fairly, where every customer and employee was respected equally. Yet now here he was sitting in his own cafe, hearing a young woman utter words as bitter as poison. He opened his eyes and they shone with a light of resolve. He knew that just one small policy on tips, a figure in the payroll, could either turn those people into lost souls or hopeful warriors. Emily stood there, her eyes still on him, glowing with a fragile but fierce trust, a trust in a founder she never thought she'd meet in real life. And Michael knew that in that moment, a test had begun. Would Foster's Bakery Cafe still have the strength to be the place where dreams of justice could grow? The air in the cafe felt drained. The coffee machine hissed softly in the corner like an urgent reminder. Michael looked up, his gaze, like an arrow piercing every nook and cranny of the familiar cafe. In those eyes, a fire was quietly burning, and he knew it was time to do something to turn that fire into a beacon for those still searching for the light of justice. Michael lowered his gaze to the notebook Emily was holding in her trembling hands, as if every ounce of faith she had was about to drip down with each bead of sweat soaking into the paper. A blurred ink spot bled into the corner of the page like a wound just torn open in the young woman's heart. He stood up slowly. Every move he made seemed to carry 10 times the weight, and his eyes no longer swept over everyone but stopped squarely on every single face. That gaze carried an unspoken message. "I'm here, I've heard." His steps took him to the espresso counter. He looked deep into the eyes of Joe, the young barista, with blonde hair hiding behind the espresso machine, his face pale sweat soaking through the beige uniform. He tried to mask his confusion, but his eyes glistened as if waiting for a final verdict. Michael's voice was gentle, but it rang out like a wake-up call. "Joe, have you ever worked a shift that dragged on for hours under a hot, glaring lamp? Your shirt soaked through with sweat and still had to smile while the clock ticked on. Like drops of water eroding a person's spirit." Joe shivered, his hand tightening around the coffee cup's handle, his lips pressed together, his eyes brimming with shame. He nodded slightly, as if confessing a sin he had hidden for too long. Michael nodded, his gaze reflecting both empathy and resolve. He turned, walking toward Emily, the girl standing precariously on the edge between courage and the fear of being fired. He looked at her, his voice softened but carried a heavy weight. "Emily, today you said what I should have been the one to say a long time ago. A fair tipping system, a decent meal that's not a luxury, it's the bare minimum every employee deserves." That statement fell like a knife, splitting the heavy air that enveloped the cafe. A young mother still cradling her child discreetly wiped away a tear that was both comforting and bitter as she watched a flesh-and-blood CEO daring to confront the truth. Michael took a deep breath, his eyes now blazing like a flame in the dark. "I once stood where you stand. I used to deliver pastries at dawn. I had to eat customers' leftovers to save money. I understand you, and I promise myself that Foster's Bakery Cafe will never become a place where staff have to choose between working and eating." A whisper rose from a corner of the cafe, a middle-aged man, perhaps a long-time regular, his eyes red and teary. He's really listening." Michael continued, his voice as firm as stone. "Give me one day, just one day. I will sit down with the management team, review every tipping policy, salary structure, and working condition. I can't promise to change everything overnight, but I promise I'll be the first to put my hand on that plan." Emily burst into tears. She covered her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking with emotion. A tear dropped to the cold tile floor, mingling with the lingering scent of apple pie in the air like a silent but powerful vow. Michael looked at her, his gaze, as if wanting to instill in her the faith to believe in herself. "Emily, you've shown me that Foster's isn't just a brand, it's a home for the people who've poured their sweat, tears, and trust into this place. Today, I promise I will not let that trust be betrayed." He turned, his eyes scanning the entire cafe, pausing on each face that held its breath, watching him. His voice rang out steady as a vow. "Tomorrow will be different. You can count on that." A gentle breath swept through the space, followed by a ray of sunlight that pierced through the glass window, shining down on the table where Michael had sat when it all began. There, he still stood like a lighthouse in the stormy night, ready to light the way ahead, not just for himself, but for everyone who needed to be illuminated with the flame of hope. Ethan took his phone out of his pocket, his movements precise, as if each finger had been programmed to carry out exactly what he was about to do. The light from the window reflected on the screen, casting a glow on his determined face. He dialed the number, each button press resonating through the heavy air, filled with the scent of pastries and hot coffee. His voice rang out deep and sharp as a blade slicing through the dense atmosphere. "Karen, activate Protocol 7. On the other end, Karen's voice responded, steady and cold as tempered steel. The voice of someone who had long grown accustomed to orders that carried weight. "Understood." "Proceeding, sir." Ethan lowered the phone, his eyes sharp as an arrow piercing through the silence that had suddenly fallen. He turned to face Lily, the young waitress who stood frozen between two worlds, one filled with worry reflected in her eyes, the other with a faint flicker of hope trembling between her hands. "I am Ethan Carter." His voice rang out calm, yet resolute, each word like a hammer blow striking down the walls of injustice encasing the cafe. "CEO of Sunrise Bakery, and I am standing inside my own cafe." That moment felt like a circuit had been cut. Everything fell silent. The clinking of coffee spoons ceased, the wheels of pastry carts stopped turning, the chatter of casual conversation vanished. Everything froze, every eye turned to Ethan, some filled with shock, some with disbelief, and some with hope that was just beginning to bloom. An older man sitting in the corner of the cafe leaned forward slightly, his breath catching in his throat. A college student near the window raised her hand to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, as if witnessing a miracle. At the pastry counter, another employee, brown-haired and slender, clenched the towel in his hand, his eyes shining as though freed from an invisible chain. Ethan still stood there, unhurried, his gaze sweeping across each face, watching him where silent questions surged. He knew this wasn't just a statement of identity. It was a declaration of justice, a declaration that all injustices would one day be revealed. Lily stood frozen, her lips parted, but no words escaping. In her eyes shone worry, but deep down there was also a spark of newly ignited trust. She knew that just one small change, one drop of courage from this CEO could change everything. Ethan gently tightened his grip on the phone in his hand trembling for a moment, not out of fear, but because he understood the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders at that moment. His gaze grew steadier, his voice rising like a vow, "Let justice be kindled right here." A faint breath escaped from the back of the cafe, like the sigh of hearts that had waited too long for this moment. In everyone's eyes, Ethan was no longer just a CEO. He had become a symbol of change, of a new beginning that everyone had hoped for but had never dared to believe. Ethan clenched the phone tighter, his breath, even his gaze sweeping over every face in the cafe, pausing on a detail that only those truly paying attention would notice: a small sign hanging just above the pastry counter with the words "Regulars given priority" scrawled in white chalk on a faded blackboard. It was small, almost swallowed by the bustling surroundings, but to Ethan at that moment it was a bitter reminder. He walked straight to the pastry counter, his cold gaze startling the brown-haired employee behind it. Ethan raised his hand and pointed directly at that sign, his voice low, each word striking like a drumbeat in the hearts of those listening. "This," he said, his finger brushing the sign, "is what has killed the fairness of this very place." The air in the cafe thickened. Every eye turned to the sign like a piece of evidence. The older man in the corner looked up, his eyes, hollowed, his lips trembling, as if about to utter an apology for himself. Ethan continued, his voice rising like a verdict. "Justice is not just a sign to hang for show. It's about how you treat every customer, no matter who they are." His voice was as sharp as steel, his eyes piercing into the gaze of every employee. Lily stood behind the counter, her eyes glistening with tears not yet shed, her lips pressed tight, her hand clutching the towel like a talisman. A teaspoon fell to the floor, clinking like the opening salvo of a revolution. Ethan raised his hand, pulled the white tablecloth from the pastry counter, and shook it out like he was sweeping away the dust of injustice and deceit. In that moment, he wrote a new declaration without needing a single word. Starting today, he paused, his eyes sweeping across everyone. There will be no more room for injustice here. Every person who walks through these doors will be welcomed equally with kindness and fairness. A heavy breath passed through the air. A single tear rolled down Lily's cheek, falling to the tile floor like an affirmation. Ethan clenched his fist lightly, his palm warming like a fire of change that had begun to kindle, and he knew it would burn away every injustice that had taken root here. Michael stood tall, his shoulders broad, exuding a quiet confidence. His voice rang out, each word solid as a nail hammered in place, making the entire cafe fall silent as if someone had flipped a switch. "Linda Walker, you and your entire shift today are officially fired for discriminatory practices and unfair tipping." Each word fell like a dagger into Linda's heart. She stood frozen, her eyes vacant, her face as pale as a wall stripped of its fake paint. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The hand holding the coffee cup trembled violently, a drop of coffee splashing onto the floor, spreading like a sinister question mark. On the other end of the phone, Claire's voice rang out, steady, but cold as steel forged in fire. Confirmation sent. HR is awaiting orders to retrieve employee files and revoke all system access. A light breeze drifted through the window, carrying the scent of apple pie and lingering coffee through the air, a reminder that this place had once been a haven, but had now become a battlefield of justice. Emily stood by the pastry counter, her hand trembling like a leaf in a storm. Her eyes were wide, glistening with a mixture of hope and emotion, as though she had just witnessed something she never thought she would see. the founder she admired standing up to protect her without hesitation. Michael turned his gaze, sweeping across each face, staff, and customers, where every glance reflected anticipation, fear, and even reverence. His voice rang out once more, deep but strong, like a flame ignited in the darkness. This cafe will be temporarily closed for 24 hours. I will personally oversee the retraining of the entire team to ensure fairness, not just empty words. A hush settled over those words, heavy as midnight mist. In everyone's hearts, that voice was not just a command, it was a promise of a fairer future, a beacon in the night hands reaching out to pull them from the haze of injustices that had once seemed unchangeable. Michael gripped his phone tightly in his hand, his eyes blazing with the light of someone who didn't just want to keep the flame of justice to himself, but wanted to share it with everyone who dared to dream of a brighter tomorrow. Michael tightened his grip on the phone, his breath quickened, but his eyes remained steadfast. He lifted his head, letting his gaze sweep the room once more. His eyes stopped at Emily, the young woman now clutching the order book, her eyes shining like a small flame in the long night. Michael stepped forward, standing opposite her, his voice softening but losing none of its firmness. "Emily, I need you to take on the role of acting shift manager for the next 24 hours. Emily froze her eyes, widened her breath, caught as if she had never dared to dream of this moment. Her eyes brimmed with faith and hesitation like someone handed a torch in the dark. "I believe in you," Michael said, his voice as firm as stone, his eyes shining with hope. "No one understands the customers better than you, and no one understands what it feels like to be treated unfairly more than you do. I want you to help me oversee the retraining of the entire team to transform this place into a cafe everyone can be proud to step into." Emily swallowed hard, her hands trembling, but her lips curved into a smile, a shaky yet resolute smile. She nodded, her eyes now glowing with new confidence. Michael looked around the cafe one more time. He saw the staff's eyes now turning to Emily, where the first sparks of hope began to glow. He knew that justice didn't just come from a termination or a strong declaration. It came from the first steps of people like Emily, people willing to stand up and make a change. Michael nodded lightly, his eyes shining like the sun breaking through after a storm. "This is our chance to rewrite the story of fairness, and I believe every one of you can make it happen." A gentle breath escaped as light as the wind, but enough to stir every heart in the cafe. An elderly customer stood up and clapped slowly but sincerely. The applause spread like waves lapping against the shore, carrying the revival of hope and justice. Michael stood there, the flame of resolve in his eyes now radiating into a light, the light of someone ready to turn promises into actions and actions into the power of change. Michael took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly, but his gaze still shone with the flame of determination. He turned his eyes sweeping across every face, watching him as if writing an irrevocable promise. That gaze contained not only unwavering resolve but also the light of compassion, a light that anyone witnessing it could feel. His voice rang out warm but powerful, every word echoing like a vow carved into the hearts of everyone present. Justice is not a slogan to be printed on flyers or hung on the wall. It is how we treat each other, especially those who work alongside us day after day, night after night. He paused for a beat, giving everyone time to absorb each word. In that moment, the rain outside continued to fall steady and somber, yet like a background music of hope, gentle and resilient. Michael looked up at everyone, his eyes shining with trust. "If I can do that here, then I am sure that all of you can do it wherever you are. Let's turn justice into action, into the breath of life itself." A moment of silence, as if all sounds had paused to make way for his voice. Then a clap rang out, scattered but sincere, joining the rain falling outside. That applause was not just praise, but the sound of hope being sown quietly, but determinedly. Michael turned, walking slowly towards the door. The light from the window highlighted his silhouette, an image etched into the minds of everyone who had witnessed that moment. The moment an ordinary but strong-willed person chose to stand up for change and taught everyone that justice is not just a luxury title, but a responsibility and an action, a flame that anyone can light in their own heart. Ordinary but strong, a black CEO dressed simply, but strong enough to confront injustice. Calmness can be stronger than any shout. Michael didn't need to raise his voice, his eyes and actions said it all. Power comes from action. Michael did not just talk. He stood up to act, to handle the situation, and to commit to change. Justice is not just a title, it is a responsibility, an action to create a fair and humane environment.